Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and contrary to what you might think, it's not coming from the opposition. For the very first time, Republicans themselves are beginning to resist Donald Trump. We are witnessing an underlying movement, often quiet but very real, aimed at blocking this thirst for absolute power that he is trying to maintain at all costs. Between declarations of national emergency, rhetoric worthy of a state of war, and a panic settling in behind the scenes, we are at the heart of a head-on collision where Congress is finally trying to draw a red line. This isn't just another political spat or a news story that will vanish tomorrow. It is a true test of whether American power remains governed by the law or by the mere instincts of one man. Stay focused until the end, because what is playing out here could redefine how power works in the United States long after this current news cycle has calmed down. Imagine the scene. It's late in Washington and phones are lighting up all over Capitol Hill. Aides are whispering and senators are double-checking their screens to be sure what they're reading is actually real. The president is furious, but he isn't angry with the Democrats or the media. He is furious with his own camp. For the first time in a long while, the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls of power. And that is where the real danger always begins. Because right now, Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. And take note, this isn't the usual internal bickering of the MAGA movement or anonymous leaks meant to scare donors. This is something much deeper, colder, and far more consequential. It touches directly upon what Trump considers vital: power without any oversight. The reason this revolt is so crucial isn't just because some supporters feel betrayed by broken promises, like the pledge not to start new wars or the fight against the ever-rising cost of living. It's primarily because Republican lawmakers are starting to act openly against the authority that Trump is desperately trying to preserve. When the system's internal safeguards begin to activate, a president doesn't react with calm. He escalates, he dramatizes, and he declares states of emergency. That is exactly what we are seeing: a presidency that bets everything on spectacle and the language of crisis to mask an internal collapse. At the center of this revolt lies a terrifying reality that even Washington veterans find hard to voice. The president has publicly considered using military force in a way that could drag America into a conflict, not with a distant adversary, but with its own allies. When this possibility was exposed, it sent shockwaves through the Capitol. Because once you strip away the slogans, you're left with a scenario that seems absurd, but can no longer be ignored. Greenland isn't a vacant lot on a real estate map. It belongs to Denmark, a NATO ally. The core principle of NATO is collective defense. Any military action against that territory would theoretically place the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The mere fact that members of his own party have to explain this publicly shows how far the debate has derailed. No one voted for a presidency that risks war with allies over rhetorical land acquisitions. This is where Trump's worldview becomes a breaking point. He doesn't perceive geopolitics through the lens of alliances, treaties, or shared security. He sees everything as property, as leverage, as a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. That mindset might work in a boardroom, but in world politics, it can cost lives. Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president presents military action as an option, the machinery starts moving, whether Congress agrees or not. That is why the War Powers Act has suddenly become the primary battlefield, serving as the constitutional emergency brake. When that brake was pulled and Republicans joined Democrats to limit the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump didn't seek to negotiate. He responded with rage and threats. This is the typical reaction of someone who believes power is personal and suddenly discovers it is conditional. Finding out that the loyalty of his own camp has limits is an existential threat to him. His entire strategy relies on the image of inevitable force and total control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of his own party publicly saying no, especially on matters as grave as war powers and constitutional limits. Faced with this resistance, Trump does not back down. He changes the frame. He uses the language of emergency, declaring extraordinary measures not as policy tools, but as weapons of combat. The National Emergency Declaration regarding Venezuelan oil assets fits this pattern perfectly. It allows him to present himself as the sole protector of national security while framing dissenting lawmakers as obstacles. Yet the reality is far more complex, and the benefits of such measures would primarily go to energy multinationals rather than ordinary citizens. But complexity has never been his goal. The goal is dominance, distraction, and control of the narrative. Emergencies allow for rules to be changed, authority to be centralized, and attention to be diverted from embarrassing questions, such as those regarding unexplained delays in transparency and the release release of long-promised documents. This situation shows that we are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who views every institutional limit as a personal insult. It's no longer a question of ideology, it's a question of structure. Republicans today are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of betrayal or an act of preserving the republic. History won't remember who shouted the loudest on social media. It will remember who stood up when the rules were on the verge of breaking. This revolt is the first sign that internal safeguards are finally being tested by the very people who know how dangerous unchecked power can become when it is draped in the spectacle of permanent emergency. This internal rebellion we are witnessing is not a mere glitch in the system. It is a symptom of a seismic fracture within the state apparatus. To truly understand what is at stake in this second phase of the crisis, we have to look beyond the sensational headlines and focus on the mechanics of power that Donald Trump is attempting to bypass. What we are seeing today is the systematic use of national emergencies as a routine tool of governance, a method designed to hollow out the substance of Congress. But this time, the maneuver is hitting a wall of unprecedented resistance. Key Republican figures are realizing that if they allow this precedent to stand, the very role of a legislator will become obsolete. We are no longer talking about disagreements over taxes or immigration. We are talking about the survival of the separation of powers. The most heated point of friction involves the management of strategic resources and military interventions. When the president mentions interventions or the seizure of assets, such as in the Venezuelan case, it's not just about foreign policy. It is a deliberate strategy to seize financial powers that the Constitution normally reserves for the House of Representatives. By declaring an emergency, Trump is attempting to bypass the democratic process of debate and voting to unlock funds and impose sanctions. This governance by decree is what has finally exhausted even his most loyal allies. These lawmakers find themselves trapped. On one hand, they fear Trump's base, which demands absolute loyalty. On the other, they see the very institution they serve being transformed into a mere rubber stamp. What terrifies observers in Washington is the speed with which the language of threat has become the norm. When a Republican senator expresses a doubt, they are no longer treated as a colleague with a differing opinion, but as a traitor to the nation. The psychological pressure is immense. Yet, despite this, votes are starting to shift. Why? Because the risk of an uncontrolled military escalation has become too real to ignore. The idea that the president could, on a whim or for the sake of political theater, commit armed forces without prior consultation has shattered the final circle of trust. Recent debates over the War Powers Act show that Congress is desperately trying to take back the keys to the vault and control over the military before it's too late. Another crucial aspect of this shift is the total opacity surrounding White House decisions. Essential documents that should be public, or at least shared with parliamentary committees, are being classified or simply withheld without explanation. This withholding of information isn't an administrative oversight, it's a weapon. By starving Congress of facts, Trump paralyzes its ability to act. This is where the Republican revolt takes a technical but vital turn. Party members are now demanding accountability for these unexplained delays. They are demanding transparency regarding the true intentions behind troop movements and crisis declarations. They are beginning to understand that permanent urgency serves primarily to mask an absence of coherent strategy and to protect interests that aren't necessarily those of the American people. We are at a crossroads. If this stage of the conflict teaches us anything, it's that political loyalty has a limit. The instinct for institutional self-preservation. Trump has built his career on the idea that everything is negotiable and every rule can be bent. But by attacking the fundamental prerogatives of Congress, he has touched the holy of holies of American politics. The coming days will be decisive. Either the president succeeds in crushing this dissent through fear and intimidation, or we will see the birth of a cross-party coalition capable of restoring the balance of power. The tension is at its peak because everyone knows that if this dam breaks, there will be no remaining check on the exercise of absolute personal power. This is no longer a fight for a party. It is a fight for the very core of how the country is run. As we move into this final act, the atmosphere in Washington has shifted from mere tension to an all-out struggle for the soul of the government. The central question is no longer about which policy wins, but about who actually holds the ultimate authority when the cameras are turned off. Trump is now doubling down on a siege mentality, framing himself as a leader besieged by a deep state that now includes his own former allies. This is a dangerous escalation because it forces every single person in the Republican Party to make a choice that will define their legacy. Do they stand with the tradition of constitutional checks and balances, or do they surrender to the era of the strongman presidency? One of the most revealing elements of this current standoff is the sudden focus on government transparency, or the lack thereof. For months, there have been promises of full disclosure regarding sensitive operations and internal decision-making processes. Yet, we see a pattern of strategic delays. Every time a deadline for transparency approaches, a new emergency is manufactured to reset the clock. This isn't just bureaucratic foot-dragging. It is a calculated effort to ensure that by the time the truth comes out, the political landscape has already been irrevocably altered. The Republican rebels have caught on to this. They realize that information is the only currency that matters in a democracy, and they are tired of being kept in the dark while major decisions are made in the shadows of the Oval Office. The stakes are further heightened by the rhetoric of national survival. When a leader starts describing political opposition, even from within his own party, as an existential threat to the nation, the path to compromise is effectively destroyed. We are seeing a presidency that is increasingly isolated, relying on a shrinking circle of ultra-loyalists who are willing to bypass traditional legal channels. This isolation is what makes the situation so volatile. An isolated leader with access to the most powerful military on earth and the ability to declare national emergencies at will is a scenario that the Founding Fathers specifically designed the Constitution to prevent. The fact that we are even debating the limits of the War Powers Act in this context shows just how close to the edge we have traveled. Looking ahead, the outcome of this confrontation will set the precedent for the next century of American governance. If the Republican resistance holds its ground and successfully reasserts the authority of Congress, it will be a historic victory for the system of checks and balances. It will prove that the American institutions are stronger than the personality of any one individual. However, if Trump manages to bypass these hurdles through his emergency decrees and the intimidation of his critics, we will have officially entered a new era of imperial presidency. In this version of America, the law is whatever the person in the White House says it is on any given Tuesday. This is the moment where the rhetoric meets reality. The speeches have been made, the lines have been drawn, and the world is watching. What happens next isn't just about one man or one election. It's about whether the United States remains a government of laws or becomes a government of whims. As these two forces, the drive for absolute executive power and the desperate defense of legislative oversight, finally collide, the debris will fall on all of us. The era of passive observation is over. The internal structure of the most powerful nation on earth is being stress-tested in real time, and the cracks are starting to show. The events we've dissected today lead us to one inescapable conclusion. The American political system is currently undergoing its most severe stress test in modern history. What began as a series of unconventional policy moves has evolved into a fundamental battle over the nature of the presidency itself. We have seen how the War Powers Resolution, once a dormant piece of legislation, has been transformed into a desperate frontline defense for a Congress trying to reassert its role in matters of war and peace. This isn't just about Donald Trump's personal style. It is about the systemic shift toward a permanent state of emergency. By using executive decrees to bypass the power of the purse and the power of oversight, the White House has forced its own party into a corner. The Republican revolt we are witnessing is the sound of the system's internal alarms finally going off. These lawmakers are realizing that the precedents being set today, the withholding of documents, the threats against dissenters, and the use of military assets for political leverage will not disappear when the next president takes office. They are becoming the new rules of the game. The true takeaway here is that transparency is the lifeblood of accountability. When information is treated as a weapon and national security is used as a shield against legitimate inquiry, the very foundation of a representative republic begins to erode. We are at the point where the rhetoric of emergency is being used to mask a deeper crisis of legitimacy. As we look toward the horizon, the question remains, will the checks and balances designed over 2 centuries ago prove resilient enough to withstand a leader who views them as obstacles rather than safeguards? Or are we watching the birth of a new, centralized authority where the law is merely a suggestion? The collision between these two visions is the most important story in the world right now, because the debris from this crash will determine the future of democracy far beyond the borders of the United States.